The Great Little Madison by Jean Fritz, Chapter 8. In the morning of Madison's inauguration, March 4th, 1809, guns were fired at sunrise from both the Navy Yard and the nearby Fort Warburton to announce to the nation that this was a special day. Dolly Madison may already have been awake, and right away she would have noticed that it was a nice day. The weather would not interfere with the splendor of the festivities. Affectionately called the Queen-elect, Dolly had worked hard to get ready for this day. Among all the preparation, there was, of course, the matter of clothes. For the morning, Dolly would wear a long train dress of fine white cotton. She would always wear white on state occasions. And on her head, she would have a white plumed bonnet. In the evening, her gown would be plain buff-colored velvet, but her turban would be a confection of velvet and satin, topped with waving feathers of a bird of paradise. Dolly looked forward to every minute, but for James, she knew the day would be long and hard. Shortly before noon, Dolly and James stepped into their fancy chariot with silver M blazing on each door. Down Pennsylvania Avenue, they rolled through throngs of people to the Capitol, where 10,000 more people were gathered. Inside the House of Representatives, where the ceremony was to take place, every inch of space was occupied with still more people, while senators, justices of Supreme Court, and the diplomatic corps lined up on the stage with their representatives seated immediately below. All had their eyes on James Madison. For James, who had long ago dedicated his life to forming and upholding the Constitution, it was indeed a grave moment. And scary. He was pale, his hands trembled, and he must have wondered if his voice would be equal to the occasion. At first, he could only manage a whisper, but in a few moments, he was back in control. In a steady voice, low but audible, he took the oath and gave a 10-minute address in which he summed up his foreign policy. Peace with justice as long as possible. War if the nation's honor was at stake. When the ceremony was over, Madisons held open house in their own home, since Jefferson had not yet moved out of the president's mansion. Standing in the doorway, Dolly had never been a more gracious hostess, but James was soon worn out with bowing. People often remarked on the low, formal bow James gave to departing company, as if he were in dancing school, they said. Moreover, in every exchange, he always made sure that he was the last to return a bow. And today it seemed he was bowing to every last man and woman in Washington. Yet more bowing lay ahead in the evening. John Adams and Jefferson had not held inaugural balls as President Washington had, but the Madisons decided to reintroduce the custom. Perhaps they believed it would be politically popular. Perhaps Dolly simply insisted that it would be fun. As it turned out, this affair was the most crowded of the day. Long's Hotel, where it was held, was not big enough, but still the people packed in until there was not enough air to breathe. When someone tried to open the windows, it was found that they were painted shut. A few people fainted, and then the windows were broken to let in air. Dolly, however, had no intention of fainting. Her plumes waved brilliantly through it all. But James sighed. "I would rather be home in bed," he told a friend. On March 11th, the Madisons moved into the president's mansion. The fact that it needed redecorating undoubtedly pleased Dolly. What fun it would be to give this official residence the elegance it deserved. Yellow satin curtains in one room, red velvet at $4 a yard for the drawing room. In the new state dining room, she hung portraits of 3 former presidents with a life-size portrait of George Washington at one end. The frame was so heavy it had to be nailed to the wall. And in spite of the expense, $2,150, she bought 3 large mirrors. She loved mirrors and counted on them to make the room seem larger than they were. particularly the drawing room where she would hold weekly receptions. Levees, they were called. She gave her first one on May 31st, but it was so well attended, as all her receptions would be, not even with the mirror could she pretend that the room was large enough. People began to know what to expect at entertainments at the president's mansion. No pastry, ever, but they could look forward to being served ice cream, that delicious frozen dessert that Jefferson had introduced from France. Almonds, raisins, pears, apples, peaches would be passed around in baskets. If there was candy, it would be wrapped in paper on which a verse was written. Sometimes they would play cards. For all her Quaker background, Dolly was not afraid to adopt the ways of the world. Always she carried a gold enamel snuff box in her hand. Aaron Burr had deplored her habit. Aaron Burr had deplored this habit of hers. Dolly was still pretty, he said, but oh, that unfortunate propensity of snuff taking. Before long, Dolly acquired a parrot. It was something she'd wanted ever since she had been a girl. But to Quakers, a pet parrot was considered frivolous. This parrot was surely frivolous, and what was more, it used bad language. Dolly didn't mind. Indeed, every time the parrot swore, she and James laughed. But people noticed that often at Mrs. Madison's receptions, the president simply stood in the middle of the room, looking distracted. Dolly noticed too, and her heart went out to him. She knew what the trouble was, England and France. It was as if these two warring countries had moved into James's mind and taken over it. Nothing had improved since the removal of the embargo. England continued to dictate just where American ships could and could not go, what they could and could not do. And when the English needed more sailors, they stopped American ships and took them. Madison twisted and turned under the insults, for they were insults. He protested, threatened, and tried one diplomatic maneuver after another. Why couldn't England see reason? Occasionally there were moments of hope. Indeed, shortly after the inauguration, the British ambassador, David Erskine, told Madison that England was ready to sign an agreement to remove all restrictions on trade. Of course, the country was overjoyed, and on June 10th, 1809, the day trade was officially reopened. The country celebrated in its usual rollicking fashion. Madison had no reason to think anything would go wrong with the agreement. Still, he had inserted a clause into the agreement reminding King George that he had done nothing to that England officer responsible for firing on the Chesapeake. Madison wanted to keep the record straight, and Americans did indeed resent England's ignoring the incident as if it had never happened. But when King George read the clause, he was furious. He would not put up with such impertinence, he said. The deal was off. Forget it. And he recalled his ambassador to the United States, claiming that he had disobeyed instructions. Americans learned the news just 10 days after their premature celebration, so it went throughout Madison's administration. Governing the United States was like running an obstacle course, knowing that one misstep could land the country in war. The Federalists were one of those obstacles. They called Madison weak, wavering, pro-French, and entirely dependent on the advice of Jefferson. One Federalist, who kept an eye on Virginia mail, reported that in the course of 3 months, Madison had written to Jefferson 12 times. This proved, he said, that Madison couldn't make a move without Jefferson's approval. Actually, they had been corresponding about problems with a newborn lamb. Another obstacle lay with the 3 British ambassadors who, one by one, succeeded David Erskine. The first was known in Europe as a hatchet man, and indeed he did seem to approach every problem as if he had a hatchet in hand. Hardly had he arrived in America before he began talking of exchanging blow for blow. Finally, he became so hostile that Madison told him to go home. The next two ambassadors underestimated Madison and the temper of the country. There would never be war, they said. All this talk by the Republicans was simply political propaganda to help them win the next election. These ambassadors may have been influenced by Federalists, but like many people, they may have been misled by Madison's mild manner. The English government, however, was willing to believe them. After all, as one member of Parliament said, America could not shave itself or catch mice without England's help. Of course, America had caught General Cornwallis at the end of the Revolutionary War, and he was no mouse. But England seemed determined to overlook General Cornwallis and the Revolutionary War. Why France's injustices were due to Napoleon's greediness, Madison said England's were calculated to keep America weak. America might not be a colony now, but it must not become a rival. Madison tried to play one country against the other. If one country would revoke its acts of discrimination against American trade, America promised to give the other country 3 months to do the same. If the second country did not comply, America could renew its non-intercourse act against it. In August 1811, there was a flurry of hope when France did revoke its decree with the provision that England would do the same. But England did not. They seemed not to care one way or another about the Non-Intercourse Act, but Americans did. They realized what England apparently did not. The Non-Intercourse Act made war all but inevitable. New England Federalists, always partial to England, cared most of all. They were the ones who did the most trading with England, and war was the last thing that they wanted. They attacked Madison so viciously in the press that friends suggested that Madison take legal action, but he said no. However, history may judge Madison on his political performance. No one can say that he did not stand up for freedom of the press and freedom of religion whenever he had the chance. Fortunately, summers gave the Madisons a long vacation from Washington and its problems. This year, 1811, when the trouble with England was reaching its climax, James and Dolly looked forward eagerly to their time at Montpelier. Never mind that New England Federalists were threatening to impeach Madison. Next year, there would be an election, and if the people wanted to get rid of James, they could vote him out. James and Dolly were not going to bother themselves with the Federalists or thoughts of the election. They were going to give England every chance to come to its senses, and since it took 6 or more weeks for news to travel across the Atlantic, they figured that at least their summer was safe. As soon as Madison had been elected president, he had begun working on remodeling Montpelier. He added 2 new wings, one on each side, one so that his mother would have her own suite. He added basement kitchens, a library upstairs, and in the front garden a gazebo, which looked like a small Greek temple. At one point, he wrote to Jefferson asking how to make stucco. When he found out, he had the brick exterior of the house covered with stucco, and Dolly had the 3 front doors painted, her favorite color, yellow. One room in the house James called the clock room because of the tall English clock that kept time on history itself, for this was also the American history room. Busts of Washington, Jefferson, John Adams, and others stood around the sides of the room. The portraits of American heroes and pictures of patriotic events hung on the walls. There was also a marble bas relief of Madison himself. He didn't think of himself as a hero, but he could not deny that the life of the country had long ago also become his own. Dolly spoke of this summer as being one of health and peace, which shows how much she enjoyed company. The Madisons were inundated with guests that summer, some invited, some unannounced, but as far as Dolly was concerned, the more the merrier. Both in Washington and here, her sister Anna and her sister Lucy were there. where their children often came for long periods. And their children often came for long periods. At one point, there were 23 children in the house. Dolly laughed. There was plenty of room, and she and James took special joy in their nieces and nephews. But always, Dolly had to count on unexpected visitors. Before serving dinner at 4 o'clock, Dolly or James would look through the telescope that they kept on the front porch to see if anyone was driving up the road. Everyone could expect a warm welcome. The prevailing mood at Montpelier, a guest reported, was one of freedom. But Congress was to meet in November, and nothing was safe after that. Jefferson, who was not a good public speaker, had established the practice of sending his messages to Congress to be read by the clerk instead of delivering them himself. Madison followed his example. On November 5th, his speech was read by a clerk, and no matter how poorly it may have been presented, no one could mistake the urgency of Madison's message. Since war seemed inescapable, Madison said, they should not just wait for it to come. They should prepare for it. In the end, Congress agreed that all naval vessels should be made ready for duty and merchant vessels should be armed. More important, a bill was passed to enlist 25,000 men in the Army. Even though everyone knew that America didn't have the money to either pay or equip that many troops, the fact that Americans were taking such measures ought to impress England. The news would be sent to England on the ship of the Hornet, and although they could not expect the Hornet to return with a reply before April, they would be preparing for the worst. The worst was what they expected. Dolly told her sister, Anna, I believe there will be a war. And while there was still time, she wrote to a friend in Paris asking her to send large headdresses, a few flowers, feathers, gloves, stockings, black and white, and anything else pretty. But she worried about James, unable to sleep. He kept his candle lit all night while he read and planned how to carry on the war. Once war was declared, he thought, the best thing to do was to send a small army to Halifax and Quebec before the British could get the reinforcements there. And that way Canada would be held hostage. But all depended on the Hornet. As soon as the trees began to leaf in the spring, people began watching for its return. Perhaps England would reach a quick decision. Perhaps the ship would make a fast crossing. At the end of March, another ship from England did bring unofficial news. England was going to keep right on searching American ships and was preparing to send troops to Canada. That was enough for Madison. On April 1st, he called for the embargo for all American ships. Those in port should stay there. Those at sea or at foreign ports would have 90 days to get home. Then, if nothing had changed, there would be war. But there was no need to wait 90 days. On May 19th, the Hornet arrived and all hopes for peace vanished. From the official dispatches, it was clear that England had not changed its position and was not willing even to consider change. Everyone knew the next step. According to the Constitution, it was up to the Congress to declare war. And on June 1st, James Madison sent a message to the House recommending that it do so. On June 4th, the House passed a bill to declare war. On June 17th, the Senate agreed to it. The next day, President Madison signed the declaration. So the nation was at war, even though the Massachusetts Federalists and their legislator urged its citizens not to cooperate in any way. They called it Mr. Madison's War and talked again of secession. Others referred to it as the Second War of Independence. But whatever it was called, it had to be won, and the prospects were not bright. Where would the money come from? How would the Secretary of War manage? Everyone knew that Madison's Secretary of War was not the most capable man. Few knew, not even Madison, if the newly appointed generals would be good. And President Madison himself, who had no experience in war, had a temperament more suited to reasoning than to fighting. But he was dogged, conscientious, and determined. When he went out now, he wore his little round hat with a huge cockaded struck in it, signifying that he was a commander-in-chief. What no one knew was that on May 11th, while the Hornet was still in the area, England's prime minister, who had been one of the most hostile in the United States, had been shot to death by a maniac. His cabinet reassigned, and on June 16th, the New England government repealed those orders which America had found so obnoxious, all but impressment. As it turned out, America began its war one day after war may no longer have been necessary, but no one would learn of this until much later. In any case, neither side could turn back now.